Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chief Meteorologist Eric Fisher, and of course, there's been a lot of news when it comes to a multitude of agencies lately, lots of changes, and some of those involving the environment or weather forecasting. One of those was a big announcement with the EPA. We want to dig into the details of that just a little bit more. So joining us today is a special guest. It's Tracy Wholf, who is the Senior Coordinator of Climate for CBS News. Tracy, thanks for spending a little time to talk to us about this important issue today.
Hey, Eric, good afternoon.
All right, so let's start with the basics here. So there was a very large announcement from Lee Zeldin about this, and run us through some of the programs and some of the regulations that they're talking about getting rid of here in the very near future.
Yes. So Lee Zeldin, who is the administrator of the EPA, announced on Wednesday in a flurry of emails. And when I say flurry, I'm talking every minute I was getting a new one in my inbox, that the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, is looking to roll back about 31 environmental regulations. These are rules and regulations that have been passed over decades, mostly under the Obama and Biden administration, that often looked to tackle carbon emissions, which dealt with climate change. But in tackling those emissions, it was also aiming to improve air quality, water quality, and things that the EPA is responsible for, which is protecting the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, which means protecting our health and protecting the environment.
So we know that usually when it comes down to these issues, there's a couple of sides. Usually from a business standpoint, regulations are seen as somewhat onerous sometimes, maybe an inhibitor to making more profit or more money for any businesses. But when it comes to society at large, are you familiar with any polling? Like, how do most Americans tend to feel about some of these regulations, like the Clean Water Act and the EPA in general? Does it seem to be one of the departments in the government that is very well favored, or do these moves have support, or is it just something that they're talking about doing?
Of course, that's a great question. When it comes to how much do people support environmental regulation, it's a highly favorable issue across the board, politically speaking. People on both sides of the aisle want clean air and want clean water. They support environmental regulation. In fact, we just published a study on cbsnews.com looking at a recent study from the Yale School of Climate Communications. They've been looking at this issue since the early 2000s, and overwhelmingly, the majority of respondents, again, this is a bipartisan study, acknowledge and favor environmental regulation. Nobody wants to breathe toxic air or drink dirty water. And so really the byproduct of addressing clean air and clean water is that oftentimes that means you will be removing carbon pollution from some of those toxins that impact our air and water. So it's kind of a win-win situation, right? You take out carbon pollution from the air, you get healthier water. That also means we're emitting less. So we are addressing climate change. A lot of these regulations that were passed recently, things like cleaning up pollution from power plants, cleaning up pollution from cars. Those things inherently not only made our lives healthier, but also addressed climate change. But I will say, to do that, it does cost money. It's going to require power plants to have to put on technology and scrubbers to make sure that those pollutants are no longer getting in the air. It does force car companies to look at how they're manufacturing cars to reduce tailpipe emissions. But these were all things that over the course of time not only would have become cheaper in the long run, it also would have saved hundreds of millions, if not trillions of dollars on medical costs. It would have reduced premature death. So there is a trade-off here, but the trade-off in the long run is our health.
So if some of these measures do have pretty strong support in the general community of America, even if these do pass, and I assume there's going to be probably a pretty large number of lawsuits that kind of follow all of these orders, and we'll see how quickly some of them do go into effect or some of these regulations go away. How many businesses do you think would actually just basically let it fly if all of a sudden these regulations went away? Because would most of the people who are customers for these businesses, would they support them still if they were just adding more pollution all of a sudden, or not really controlling some of their emissions?
Well, here's the thing. A big reason these regulations were passed in the first place was because industry was not doing right by the environment or public health in the first place to reduce these potentially toxic emissions from entering into the environment. So that's why we had to put the regulations. That's why the government had to put the regulations in place in the first instance. One of the things that Lee Zeldin came out and said he would like to do is to reduce the burden on industry to have to follow regulations so that it makes it more economically viable for them. And then he essentially said he hopes that industry will do right by the environment and by public health and do the right thing. I think it's hard to put that burden on industry without, a carrot or stick method. But that's one of the things that this administration is looking to do. They want to make it easier for businesses to operate. I think what was interesting in Zeldin's remarks is that he talked about all the ways that he wants to make it a more pro-business climate, easier for customers. But he didn't actually talk about protecting the environment and protecting human health, which is the primary role of the EPA. So to your point, most of the things that they're looking to roll back will be challenged in court. This will be incredibly litigious. It will take a very long time. And so we'll have to kind of wait and see. But the biggest thing that this all really comes back to is the current EPA administration will need to prove with an overwhelming amount of evidence that what they're suggesting is good for human health. And I have to say the whole reason that these rules and regulations were put in place in the first place is because health experts, environmental experts overwhelmingly showed that most of these things were actually doing more to protect human health, not necessarily doing more to protect business.
I think it's one thing people could look at. I believe it's called Documerica. There's an old series when some of these regulations first went into place in the 70s, and you can look back at what a lot of American cities and landscapes looked like before things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And we haven't really grown up in the last several decades with any of those scenes because so much has changed. It's worthwhile to go and look that up and go, wow, yeah, that's right. Rivers used to catch on fire. Yes, these cities used to be choked by smog, and that's not the case anymore. And if you don't have a recent baseline for that, you probably take for granted how much things have changed. I think a lot of us are programmed that things are getting worse all the time. And really, when it comes to the environments, a lot of these regulations, whether or not they're pro or con against business, which you could have that debate, they certainly have helped the environment. Things are cleaner than they were decades ago.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think the other thing to take into account too is due to technology, to the advancement in chemical engineering, mechanical engineering. There's a lot more things that are out there in our environment these days. We talk a lot about PFAS, forever chemicals, plastics, a lot of things that have been very beneficial in our lives and made certain things easier. But we're now still kind of starting to understand some of the health impacts of those things and how do we responsibly produce those items so that we can continue to enjoy the benefits that they provide, but also make sure that they're not impacting our health. And that's really what the EPA is there to do. So I think a lot of this stuff, I get it. We want to make business easier. We want to make our lives easier. But we also don't want to do that at the expense of our health and the expense of the environment in which we live.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's what science is all about. It's always adjusting your worldview and your process based on new information that's always coming in. We don't have a static environment and static base knowledge. It's always changing every year, and we have to adjust along with it. One more question for you that kind of sticks out here. There's a big slew of announcements, as you mentioned, a big flurry of emails. Was there anything in particular that really caught your attention more than others?
Yes, there were actually two. The first one was that the administration came out and said that it's looking to revisit, that was the common word, reconsider the national air quality standards. This one I think is a really understandable thing for people to look at. So air quality standards mean how many levels of certain pollutants are we allowing into the atmosphere for us to breathe. The previous air quality standards for the United States did not reach the same thresholds that the World Health Organization recommended. So they actually strengthened them to kind of come up to those levels. But now this announcement, they want to reduce those levels again. And I just think, practically speaking, I don't really know why we would want to breathe less healthy air. So that one was a little puzzling to me. And then probably the most consequential one from a climate change standpoint is there was a ruling in 2009 from the EPA called the endangerment ruling. That is when the EPA came out and said, we believe that carbon emissions are harmful to human health and must be regulated because they contribute to climate change. That is the whole basis upon which a lot of these other regulations, like the Clean Power Plan rules, clean car rules, a lot of these other things are based upon, because essentially it gave the EPA the power to regulate carbon emissions because they're dangerous to health and causing climate change. So if the EPA were able to basically revoke this finding and say, you know what, just kidding, carbon emissions aren't harmful, climate change isn't a risk, that would really start to send a house of cards falling among a lot of other regulations that have been passed since then to address those issues. So that one, if they're able to revoke it, would really, really be quite, it would be a watershed moment in America's fight against climate change.
You did mention that a lot of this will be very litigious and will probably be in the courts for a while. We've seen a lot of these initial movements in the last couple of months all end up in the courts in some fashion or another, and we'll see where all this goes. If people did have a strong opinion one way or another and they wanted lawmakers to know about it, what's the best course of action for someone who might watch this, maybe have some strong feelings about it, and they want to share some of those with the people who are making these choices?
Obviously, reaching out to your congressional representative and letting them know that you support climate and environmental regulations is the first place to go. Again, when you're going and voting, making sure that you're voting for people that support these initiatives. I would say those are the biggest things. And, this doesn't have to happen as also on the level of Congress, making sure that you're engaged in looking at what your local representatives, what your local township, municipality is doing. That's also really important. There are some places, especially locally and on the state level around the United States, that are doing really amazing things to address environmental regulation, to address climate change. So sometimes it doesn't have to feel overwhelming, like this need that you need to go straight to the top. Honestly, the more that we can build up the support from the ground up, I think that will also start to reverberate on higher levels of government. But really, I would say being engaged, making sure that this is an issue that you vote for, that you express your opinion to your local elected leaders for, and then at the same time, just staying informed. Make sure that you're aware of what's going on, so that you can have clear conversations with friends and family about it and help spread the word. I think is also helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's been so much news lately. Some people, I think the instinctive nature is to just shut it down, to stop paying attention for a little bit because it can be overwhelming. But it is important to stay plugged in and know what's happening so that hopefully, if you have a strong feeling, you can take some action or at least be more informed, at the very least. That's great stuff. Tracy Wholf, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your insight onto this matter and something, of course, that we will continue to cover here at WBZ and CBS News when it comes to our Climate Watch. Tracy, thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a great weekend.
You as well.